Hello, everyone. Today we are speaking with Dr. Eleanor Baker. She is the English subject lead for the University of Oxford's Astoria Foundation Year, and her research interests range throughout the late medieval period. Some of these interests being book culture, religious culture, craft practices, as well as creative critical practices, folk horror literature, and also university access provision for the humanities, which I think is great and really important. So she also makes medieval and folk horror inspired prints in her spare time, which I love. That's really cool.
So much.
Of course. And so my first question I think is a more kind of broad question that I think will help a lot of young graduates and even undergraduates who are just beginning to figure out where they fall in their academic career and their research and things like that, their interests, things like that. So from what I can tell from your research, you're interested in a broad range of topics, with folk horror and book culture and materiality being these kind of big umbrella ones. And so I know a lot of graduate students find it really difficult to pinpoint their research on something or someone. And I was wondering what you think of that process of choosing what or who to study. Like, how do you approach that process of pinning down what or who interests you or resonates with you, and what led you to your own interests?
Yeah, great. Thank you. And thank you so much for having me on the podcast as well. I'm really excited.
Of course. Our pleasure.
And yeah, that's a really good question. And I should start off by saying that I think it's, to a certain degree, a career-long or a lifelong journey, kind of figuring out what you're interested in and what will fit for your kind of personal goals, for your future career. And also, you know, it sounds so lovely when someone summarizes your own research interests to them, but it's often easier when that's kind of done retroactively. You know, when you listen to an interview or read an interview with someone, or there's a kind of summary of their work, it can sound really cohesive. It can sound like there's a real kind of narrative and logic to it, which is easier to impose once it's done. I think when you're in it, and certainly speaking for myself, it does not feel so ordered at all. So I'd say the first thing is don't panic. I think that's a very common feeling and a very common problem. I remember particularly influentially for me, so I did my undergraduate degree in English at Royal Holloway, University of London. And I remember going to a kind of 10-minute drop-in session with a tutor called Harry Newman. And I remember saying, we were discussing like which question I should choose to answer an essay. And I remember saying something along the lines of I don't know if the marker's going to like that. You know, I don't know if they'll think highly of me having this response to this question. And he kind of stopped me and said, this is your degree. You can do what you want with it. Do something that interests you. That's what's most likely to keep your motivation going for the duration of you doing sometimes quite arduous work, sometimes works that's difficult or doesn't sit naturally with us. So I think that inclination to follow things that you as an individual find an affinity with or find a kind of lasting interest with is really important, rather than necessarily, for example, something that I definitely did when I was applying for graduate study, looking at different people's applications and being like, oh, well, this particular funding body seems to like projects that do things like this. Maybe I should skew it towards that direction to give myself a better chance. In my particular case, my research interests up to my doctorate kind of led quite naturally on from one another. So my undergraduate dissertation looked at marking skins in Middle English saints' lives, particularly women's saints. And then from marking skins on people, I kind of moved to marking skins on books, looking at a particular text in my MPhil, and then in my doctorate, looking at a range of different texts. So that was quite a natural progression. But I know for other people who I studied with, they would kind of discover things that they haven't been exposed to before. And that was really exciting for them, and have gone on to do amazing things with that new material. So I think, unhelpfully, for offering advice, I don't think there's one right way to do it, but also that's quite freeing as well. I would say spend time going to those random talks in other faculties at other universities to see speakers that you think, oh, that's not directly applicable to any paper that I'm taking, any exam that I'll sit. But it sounds really interesting, and just being exposed to different things often sparks something that you find useful.
That's really, really helpful. I think for me especially, I think a lot of my experience aligns with that, because my undergraduate dissertation and my graduate dissertation were very different, similar but different. So I kind of had I studied like gender and sexuality kind of studies for my undergrad dissertation. It was James Baldwin's Giovanni's Room and Patricia Highsmith's
Nice.
Carol, and so those were my two kind
Ooh.
of texts, and it was about kind of gender roles in homosexual relationships and things like that. And then my graduate dissertation was about Kathy Acker, and she was just this really cool, badass experimental novelist in the 1980s, writing in New York. And a lot of her issues also focused on gender and sexuality, but in a very different way. So kind of similar to what you're saying, it's like similar but also different kind of overlap reading. Yeah.
I think of it as sometimes like threads that you're able to tug out, and they kind of connect disparate projects together. But that takes time, honestly, most of the time, of just being able to look back retrospectively and say, oh, my overarching interest was gender and sexuality, whereas at the time it can feel like, actually, I have, a particular desire to work with this one text and I can't quite articulate it. And then you find, oh no, that's central to my research, this is what I do. So yes, I would say to anyone who's worried about it, don't panic. We're all right there being like, what keywords apply to what I do? How can I summarize that for my elevator pitch as to what I look at?
Exactly. I completely agree. And so moving a bit into your research about folk horror, I really love that phrase, folk horror. I think it's a very kind of niche definition, or a niche phrase. And I would just love, since you're the expert, if you could define folk horror for everyone listening, and how folk horror is a bit different from the Gothic or vampiric, or how medieval folk horror specifically is kind of grounded in its time. I would love to hear a bit about that. Yeah.
Yeah. So unfortunately and brilliantly, folk horror is really difficult to define and is kind of known for its amorphousness, right? So you'll find lots of things that are described as folk horrific or having folk horror elements, and it's quite difficult to actually pin down what is quite an evocative and, as you say, quite a fun term. People are often really quick to kind of gesture towards films or books or pieces of artwork, visual art, that strike with that theme. So they might say, oh, like Midsommar or The Wicker Man. They can quite easily identify it, but kind of splitting it apart and articulating it is quite difficult. I really like the work of an academic and a filmmaker called Adam Scoville. And he said that this term is a bit like a prism, right? It's quite difficult to pin down the definition tightly because it spreads out its rays in so many different ways. But there are kind of some key elements which we can look for, which is an emphasis on landscape that's usually rural or wild, isolated communities or individuals, moral or theological ideas which threaten orthodoxy or normal practices, featuring the supernatural, and that can be either latent or explicit. There can be kind of a more general sense of unease or an actual monster that's coming to get people, and often violent and ritualistic activity as well, which is where some of the more fun and also the more gory elements come into it. But there's a fantastic academic called Dawn Keatley, who's done some great work in kind of tracing where this term has come from. And she managed to find it in an interview with the director Piers Haggard, who directed the film The Blood and Satan's Claw, which is considered one of the kind of the key films which generated this wide generic consideration in kind of the late 60s, early 70s. And from there, it's kind of grown and it's been adopted by different people. But yeah, so there has been, certainly recently, I'd say since maybe 2010, there's been more of an academic interest in what folk horror represents. And you asked also about kind of how do we define it against the Gothic and the vampiric. So Dawn Keatley has really usefully defined folk Gothic as disparate from folk horror, saying that folk horror has more of an inclination towards the lurid, towards the gory, the explicitly violent, whereas the folk Gothic is supernatural but sinister, more of a sense of dread than explicit violence. But I think there's a lot of overlapping themes between the two. The question about vampirism was really interesting because I haven't really considered that in depth, but I know from my minimal understanding of vampires that in kind of wider European culture, they're sometimes associated with the aristocracy, and vampires are kind of a metaphor for a kind of parasitic aristocratic force that are sucking the blood metaphorically out of the lower classes. And I think maybe folk horror's reliance on folk beliefs and also of folk, of kind of common people, means that that sort of figure is not quite so present. But I would be very happy to be proved wrong and find woodsy vampires somewhere.
That is really fascinating. I actually never thought about vampires as being a kind of metaphor for the aristocracy. I think that's actually really telling. That's really a really interesting way of looking at, like, even films like Twilight, you know?
Yes. Yeah. Completely. And I think those are kind of really, those kind of films are really interesting examples. And the proliferation of vampires in literature that's aimed at young adults. The same way with werewolves, right? There's kind of this compulsion towards this sort of figure who's at once an outcast and in some ways more brilliant than the average human being. But I'm curious as to how the kind of myth of the vampire manifests in other cultures as well, because I know that it's one of those interesting beliefs that pops up in kind of Native American culture and African cultures as well, which must have, or perhaps have, quite a different perception of what the vampire represents. But guess would like to know more about vampires.
Definitely, me too.
Whether practically or academically, you know.
Of course. And I'm also curious how, because I guess folk horror, because it has that folk aspect, that kind of semi-Gothic, like ruins, castles in the middle of nature, these kinds of images. I guess Twilight is kind of more, obviously more modern. It's in a town. It's in, Washington State in America. And I'm wondering about this medieval aspect of folk horror. And I'm curious how you think medieval folk horror, let's say, as a phrase, is specifically grounded in like the temporal socio-political moment of, the 1300s, of 1200s, 14, like, whatever it may be. How I'm just wondering how it kind of interacts with its time. If you find that there are any socio-political factors that led to this creation of a genre that led to these images, these settings, these kinds of things, or is it just, it could exist in any time, it just is what it is, or if you find it's actually grounded in what was happening at the time?
Yeah, I think there's an argument to be made for both of those things. I think folk horror, to me, as a distinct genre, is compelling because it's often subsumed within other considerations. So there's a whole kind of swathe of critical literature written about supernatural landscapes in the medieval period, but I think this is a kind of different kettle of fish. I think particularly in the late medieval period, which is kind of my area of specialism, I think the figures are between 80 to 90% of the population, at least of England, lived rurally. So there was far more kind of interaction between common people and the natural world than there is for now, for example, where those numbers are almost reversed, that most people live in urban spaces. So I think that proximity to the natural world would have had a huge impact. And I think also the different state. I mean, I'm particularly interested in English and British folk horror, and there are other traditions of European folk horror, American folk horror, and other things like that. So that's what I'm particularly interested in. And things like in the medieval period, there would have been far greater tracts of woodland spread around the country, which have now been deforested. And there would have been different trades which operated in close proximity, like for example, the other day I went down one of those amazing research rabbit holes that I was looking at medieval charcoal burners, who are these figures that operated almost autonomously. They were quite solitary, they were isolated. They would build these large kilns, so put lots of wood in the middle and then cover it with turf to restrict the flow of oxygen. So meaning that the wood was burnt at very high temperatures, but with very little airflow to stop it actually setting up. And these people would burn charcoal in the woods on their own. They'd often make these makeshift huts to supervise the burning whilst they were out there. And I just think, wow, that's such a specific experience of the forest and of that particular occupation. I think those kinds of occupation, that kind of relationship with the land is really interesting.
Yeah.
There's been a new kind of critical anthology produced, the Routledge Companion to Folk Horror, which anyone who's interested in folk horror was very excited that a kind of handbook had come out about it. And a medievalist called Christopher Flavin talked about romance literature, which often has a conceit of a journeying knight through the landscape who encounters monsters and difficult things and ghosts or all of these things. I think that's a really interesting angle. I think my interest is more in looking at the folk part of folk horror.
Yeah.
Folk Middle English, especially when prefixed with the word lewd, meant common lay people. So if we bring that understanding of folk into folk horror and think about literature that was written for common lay people and perhaps concerning common lay people as well, I think that would be a really interesting avenue to pursue, and is certainly what my current research is looking at.
Definitely, yeah. So it's kind of like the opposite of vampirism.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Yes. Like really looking at what the common people were, not necessarily reading because they might not be literate, but what they were the audience to, what they were listening to. I'm looking in particular at the moment a text called John Merck's Festial, which contains a collection of homilies accompanied by exemplars, so little narratives drawn from lots of different places that illustrate the point of the homily, and which features bizarre happenings in forests with woods and strange stories of horses embodied by the devil and things like that. So these were homilies and exemplar written with the laity, the rural laity in mind, and that is what I'm kind of focused on of mining for folk horror conceits at the moment.
That's really, really interesting. I think it's also very, like, it also relates a lot to what you were saying, I think, about how the majority of these people did live in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the forest, which actually facilitated that as a genre because that was the reality for most people. So scary stuff can happen in the forest, you know?
Absolutely. If I've learned anything from the amount of folk horror I've read, is bad things can happen in the countryside.
Yeah, and it's also very funny that theme has kind of translated into our modern horror movies, horror literature, Stephen King. You know, Absolutely. It's never a good sign when the main character wanders into the cabin in the middle of nowhere and the boyfriend and girlfriend do a weekend away in the middle of nowhere and that's it. You know?
Yeah, we're going into the woods with a camcorder. Yeah, all of that stuff. And in part, I know some people have commented that the birth of folk horror was kind of a counter reaction to the sort of hippies movement in the 60s of returning to the land, returning to the earth. And then this sort of, but what if we bring a sinister aspect to that? And the kind of natural hostility, which you can still face in the countryside of being, you know, these predominantly white, middle and upper class spaces. A lot of people face a lot of hostility or feel a lot of anxiety in those spaces, and really drilling down into, you know, you see a maypole in the middle of the English village. That sounds like a lovely community idea, but what about with a sinister slant to that? What happens when that's problematized? So I think it's often quite an interesting reflection of how we perceive Britain and England and its culture and its practices as well.
Definitely. And I even think of films like The Blair Witch Project or things like that. That's very like this homemade kind of, I mean, we're going to get into materiality and kind of containers of art a bit later, but this kind of container of art as a film in a very conscious container, like it's a parody of a film almost, like it's they're going with a camcorder, but it's also a movie, so it's like a container of a container in a very weird meta way, you know?
Yeah, that's so interesting. I hadn't thought about the film like that, but you're also making me think, with that reference to containers and kind of media being really, really central to how we perceive and understand the film, of also films like Midsommar, where one of the characters is due to be writing a thesis and needs to pick a topic. And so actually it's the framing, the whole reason why they go to this space is because he wants to find something interesting to write about. And there's quite often this kind of, if there's not a desire to escape, there's this desire to investigate, whether it's through film or writing, and that investigating leads to bad end.
Exactly. It's almost like people shouldn't make movies or write theses about.
Yeah, people shouldn't do doctorate. Don't do it. Stop now while you can. It's too late for me, but
it's such a funny message. Like, you're right. Both of these films are kind of like, it's like investigative journalism almost, and and they all die in the end. So it's like, don't do it.
And that's one of the interesting things about folk horror as well, and why I think I'm so drawn to it. So my whole interest came out of my recreational reading, that it was the genre that I enjoyed reading to fall asleep at night, however strange that sounds. And I was like, oh, I wonder if I can kind of add a research bent to this. But I think what keeps me coming back is with folk horror, there's no guarantee in that genre whether it's going to have a tragic or a happy ending. There are some times where the characters do escape, or they do manage to integrate well into the community, and the kind of horrific aspect of it is solved. And there are other moments when it very much isn't, and there's a lot of blood, gore, murder, and the kind of central problem of the text is not really resolved. So I think because that's what keeps me coming back, is that you don't have a guarantee of what's going to happen in the end. It's kind of 50-50.
It's so true. It's so true. And I think, I don't know why I'm stuck on the Blair Witch Project, but I'm just remembering what you were saying about kind of a lot of these places are like predominantly white, and like, you know, these people are kind of going out into the woods like for no reason often, like the Blair Witch Project, they just like decide to go. And I think that also is very, very interesting, where it's kind of like, it began out of necessity because people in the medieval ages just lived in the middle of nowhere because they had no money. And now there's this almost like parodying of it, where like, let's just go for fun, you know?
Yeah. And the kind of almost a more progressive reverse of that is one of my favorite authors who is kind of a straight horror slasher writer, but also dabbles in the folk horrific, is an author called Stephen Graham Jones, who is a Blackfeet author from America, and he writes about Native American beliefs. His characters are often First Nations, Native American, and incorporates those beliefs into a very modern setting of these characters in a 21st century. And that's kind of like a really interesting bringing together of those threads in an American setting with folklore that's specifically related to a very distinct sense of place. So yeah, there's an awful lot of incredible creative writers, artists, filmmakers, academics who are doing really creative things with the genre as well, which keeps it interesting too.
Definitely. I think it's this kind of very cohesive genre, but then there are so many shoot-offs of it. For sure.
The prism image is coming back.
Yeah, exactly. So just kind of moving along more specifically to your research, I had a look at your 2023 interview with the Thinker's Garden, which was really, really interesting to read. And I'm just going to give a quote for everyone. You had said that you had, quote, previously stumbled across book curses when leafing through manuscripts, and as an avid fan of folklore literature, you were, quote, interested in the intersection of the macabre and book history, which I think is a very great way of putting it. And I would love to hear a little bit about what the macabre, which I think is an amazing word, what the macabre means to you, and what do you think makes it such an elusive, obscure kind of phrase or word when pinpointing exactly what, if we say a literature of the macabre, because that kind of is kind of hard to imagine. So why do you think it's so elusive, and what, and maybe it has to be elusive, but I would love to hear about the word macabre and what you kind of think of it. Yeah.
Thank you. I very much appreciate your diligent reading of that interview. I think often it was a lovely interview to do, and often you kind of reflecting back on your own writing towards something like that clarifies exactly what you're trying to do with something. So my understanding of the macabre, which I had to kind of revisit to understand even in advance of this interview, to make sure that I had a conception of that term that made sense. I think you're entirely right that you seem to be picking up in a thread of my research, which I hadn't appreciated, of ambiguous terms and drilling down into what that looks like. And I understood it as a term that exposes a fascination with death, the processes of death, and often expresses a kind of fearfulness about death that manifests in lots of different ways. For me, I consider it a focus on the lurid, and I don't necessarily mean that in terms of gory, horrifying things. So, for example, my limits with folk horror is that I'm not very good at watching horror and slasher films. I don't think I could sit through them.
Me too.
But I can do suspense. So I think coming to book history and reading medieval texts that so often contain images of death that are quite alien to us, but at once quite familiar as well. And this quality of kind of reveling in the interesting images that death projects and that we create around it. We were talking just before we started this interview on the kind of strange little skeletal illustrations that you can find in medieval manuscripts. And it was exactly that kind of quality which I wanted to look at. You know, why are we featuring these strange dance macabre, dancing skeletons at the bottom of the page? Why are they wearing funny hats in this manuscript? You know, what is happening there? So that's what kind of drew me to it. Yeah.
I think we as a society have moved away from kind of a fascination with death. Like it's almost a taboo subject, I feel like, in modern capitalist society. It's all about, what's the next product? What's the next iPhone? What's the next this, the next that? It's a very forward-looking society. And I feel like it has an emphasis on rejuvenation and life and products and producing. I feel like kind of that underlying vibe. And do you think that potentially has to do with moving away from a fixation on religion, where we're now more secular? Is that kind of, do you think that's a connection?
That's a really interesting thought. I wonder, I don't have a definitive answer to it. I think as you were talking, I was thinking, this is a very, you were talking about ideas of reproduction, generation, always pushing. And to me, that's kind of a very capitalist motivation, right? How can we move it bigger, better? We don't look backwards. We're only ever getting stronger. Nobody dies. That's the end of what we're hoping for. Immortality. And I think sometimes often acknowledging the limits and the fact that there is something, you can have a good death. I know there's movements which are called kind of death positive movements, which encourage this kind of pre-planning of your own death, to take control of it, making sure your affairs are in order, understanding what to expect from your body and your mind, for your loved ones and for yourself. And I think you're right. It's something we find very embarrassing and difficult. Which in turn makes the process itself, I imagine, excessively embarrassing and difficult. And we relegate death and illness off to the side. We find it uncomfortable, so we don't like to look at it. And we often find things like, we'll say that things are inappropriate if something is centered around finding the humor in death, finding a sense of lightness in it, or a sense of practicality in it. People will determine that that's inappropriate. Whereas actually in all other facets of life, that's how we move through it, right? That's how we understand it. And I certainly sense that in medieval art and literature, and it's a reality. It's a lived material reality that is terrifying and upsetting and uneasy and morbid, but that there is joy in life to be found in that itself. Death is a part of life, so let's explore it as much as we do the other facets of it.
Exactly. I think, yeah, that's very, very well put, I think. And I'm not sure why we as a society have kind of, I think we never talk about death. I think we kind of try to forget that it exists.
Yeah.
And it's almost like a shameful, taboo subject. And it's really interesting when you have text centered around death and gore. And it almost feels a bit like psychoanalytic to me. I studied a lot of psychoanalysis as part of my dissertation. That was kind of the lens I was looking at a lot of this stuff from. And it almost feels like, I think some of the bigger ideas in psychoanalysis have to do with these subconscious drives, right? Like Eros and Thanatos that drive every human subconsciously. You have the drive for desire and life and reproduction and forward thinking. And then you have the desire and drive for death, which is the Thanatos drive. And I think a lot of these thinkers, like Freud, like Jung, like Kristeva, a lot of these old psychoanalytic thinkers believe that humans are driven fundamentally by march towards death, actually. And I think that's a really interesting intersection with folk horror, potentially, where these individuals are also very much fascinated, if not driven, by the fact that everyone is marching towards death.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think an acknowledgement of the cycle as well, rather than there being, an endless march towards progress. Things can only get better. We keep, plowing money into something or that, which this makes it sound like I'm very anti-progress. No, that's not the case, but that actually acknowledging the cyclical nature of something, that we need a combination of rest and work and play, that from death comes life and from life comes death. And actually sometimes these are inescapable, seasonal, cyclical changes that we move through and we all experience, would perhaps add more of a relaxedness to our life, of just acknowledging the inevitable, embracing the inevitable, trying for better. But I think there's a really good case to be made for, as my partner, he's a nurse, and he's very much pro this idea of having a good death, kind of this practical experience of having a good death and being cared for and planning for it adequately is really important.
It's really interesting, this idea of like planning for death, because I think we often think of death as something that just like is a shock and a surprise and a tragedy, and it just happens, and it's, oh no, but she was alive and now it's all this, but this idea of like, no, it's not a shock. I'm actually going to plan for it.
It's the only thing that's guaranteed, right? We will all die. And even that is, I'm not saying you should drop it into every conversation, but even kind of acknowledging that in certain conversations comes as a shock to people, and they don't want to have this memento mori, this reminder of death.
Exactly.
But it is something that we live with constantly. We can't escape it.
Exactly. And why do you think that medieval thinkers were more forward thinking about death? That's quite funny, quite oxymoron. But why do you think they were more forward thinking about death, do you think?
Honestly, I'm sure there are people who are far more qualified to answer this. If I could sidestep it slightly, you asked me the initial question of the intersection between book history and the macabre.
Yes.
So I can if I look at like medieval book history in particular, I think one of the things I initially came to when I was finding my research interest was being fascinated by the fact, at a basic level, that many medieval manuscripts are made out of skin. The pages of parchment are made from animal skin. And this was kind of presented as well, of course, this is the materiality of the text. And I was kind of stunned by this, that when you're handling a medieval manuscript, you're handling a kind of collection of dead bodies. And we do this all the time as humans. We use animal products. But I thought there was something particularly interesting and macabre about this idea that you're holding a book that is quite often bound in treated animal skin, and then we are writing our words. The ink used to write these words sometimes contains animal products, and then we are leafing through very finely wrought pieces of animal skins. I thought there was something really interesting in that, and even at a basic level, these are objects which are crafted from death. So that was the kind of connection I had, and from that it led to an interest in devotional literature that drew on that understanding. So I came to a group of texts, a group of poems called the Charters of Christ, which compared Christ's crucified body to the parts of a legal charter. And it would say things like, oh, the letters made on this legal charter are like the wounds, the scratches made on my skin. The seal, the wax seal is like my side wound. My skin is like the parchment of the sheet. So they weren't ignorant of this. They found this a really productive metaphor to use as a means of understanding torture and horror and life and death and joy and memory. So that's how I've kind of connected the two things.
Definitely. That's really, really interesting. I'm really fascinated with the intersection of like language, which I think is very intellectual and linguistic and not at all physical because it's spoken. It's, you know, I think language is it's conceived of, I should say, as very intellectual and very not tangible, let's say, or not tactile. The intersection of language and actually physicality and tactility and all of this stuff, kind of like what you're saying about the language itself. The book itself is a product of physicality. It's actually a body. It's actually blood. It's actually whatever, you know?
Yeah. And your understanding of language there's a fascinating medievalist called Kathy Causey who wrote a whole book on images of language. So what do these images, these carvings, which show people speaking, paintings, descriptions in books, show about how people thought the power of speech worked, the power of language worked? And that's a text that I found endlessly fascinating and full of interesting examples for someone who was looking at almost like the reverse, the other end of it. How do our understandings of the book kind of influence our ideas about concepts?
Yeah, definitely. I think we're going to get into language and books and containers and physicality and materiality and how they're all kind of wrapped up with each other very soon. So we're gonna speak more on that very soon. But before that, I would love to hear a little bit about your upcoming book, Book Curses, which is out in November, I believe. Amazing. And yes, so can you give us a little sneak peek about what to expect in this upcoming book and tell us a little bit about what it kind of focuses on?
Absolutely. So this was an incredibly fun project. So it's coming out with Bodleian Publishing, which is wonderful because as I work at the University of Oxford, it meant that I could take, you know, enormous joy in pouring through manuscripts and looking physically for the examples of these. So I had come across them and was aware of the concept of book curses whilst I was doing my doctorate, but it wasn't directly relevant exactly to what I was researching. So I was kind of thinking, okay, put a pin in this. So the book itself is like a very small anthology of book curses dating from around 2000 BCE, for examples from the ancient Near East all the way up to the modern day. So it's examples taken from literary history throughout this period, mainly Eurocentric, and then mainly kind of Britain-centric as well. Certainly they become very Anglo-centric towards the end. But yeah, exploring how the book curse as a form changed over time, finding the most funny and fearsome examples of these book curses, how they reflect the living conditions of the period, what people found scary, what people found funny. And yeah, they're often these tiny, often rhyming lines placed at the beginning or end of a book, which say things like, black is the raven, black is the rook, black is the person who steals this book. So they're kind of haunting. Yeah, and the earliest examples are actually not book curses at all. And some of the examples are not written on books at all. They're written on legal documents or stone stelae, so stone monuments. So exploring this concept of what makes a book curse an earlier version of the book was called Bookish Maledictions, to kind of gesture towards they're bookish, but they're not all in books. And yeah, so it kind of drew on my interest in textual materiality from my research, but kind of with a more, in some ways, more humorous outlook, and with a more kind of public-facing outlook as well.
That's really, really interesting. I love the idea of someone, and we're going to kind of get into this, but someone invoking language to harm physically, you know, because, you know, it makes me think of that phrase, what is it? Sticks and stones can break my bones, but words can never harm me. But this is the opposite. This is actually, no, words can and will harm you, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So that I think is really interesting. And I saw that you were, in your Thinker's Garden interview, you mentioned that some of these were written in like textbooks, cooking books, things like that. So they're kind of, I guess they're kind of warning people to stay away from their cooking book. Is that kind of what's happening here?
Yeah. So one of the things that I consider in the introduction to this book is, why have the owners of these books, who were not necessarily sometimes they were the authors of the text in this book, but not necessarily, why have people chosen to write these curses? Is it because they, I argue that it's because to some degree they considered these books valuable, right? And this could be for a variety of different reasons. So if it's a very finely wrought, lavishly decorated medieval manuscript whose cover is covered with jewels and which has taken months, if not years, to make, then there's kind of there's a material and economic loss for that book being stolen. It's valuable because it's worth money to make that book, as well as being worth something to the community that made it. But for other people, maybe the value is because it's a family possession that's been passed down over time. Maybe it's a book that belonged to a child who was being bullied, and therefore it is something that they really wanted to keep safe. Maybe it contains secret knowledge that belonged to a particular trade or to a particular individual. There's all kind of different values for why someone might want to protect something with a curse. But yeah, this impulse to cause harm on something that damages your property is also something that's just a really interesting human impulse that is kind of the darker side of human beings, I think, as well, that desire to lash out in a lasting way, and quite a final way on these curses. Like a lot of these curses, they don't just threaten, I hope you have a bad day. It's, I hope you die. I hope you are hanged, burnt, quartered. I hope you get the plague. These are serious consequences.
Yeah. It also makes me think a lot about ideas of like ownership, and the fact that this is their property. I own this, and the idea that if you take someone else's if you take what someone else owns, you will die. And I guess also tying that back to book history and dying and death and all of these kinds of ideas, it, I guess, suggests that if you are to harm or take someone's book or literature or language, that has a physical impact on your body and your life. So it's not only ideas of the books actually contain images, physical images of death, but no, in the real world, that those physical images will come to life, which I think is fascinating.
Yeah, and something interesting in some of the work that I read, and this isn't always the case, but said that actually this was just reflecting judicial punishment from if you stole a valuable manuscript from a monastery and you were caught, you could be killed for that transgression. So it's a curse, but it's also quite a practical warning that this will be physically enacted against you. But yeah, I think you're right in that kind of, it's acknowledging that a book that is almost more than the sum of its parts, right? It's a materially valuable object in some cases, but also represents emotional investment or intellectual investment, or a sense of someone's history. There's all sorts of different kinds of value and sense of ownership, as you said, coming into that.
Yeah, and it makes me think again back to how we were saying that our society is a lot less interested in death and talking about death right now, kind of in comparison to in the medieval times. And I guess that is reflected in the law because right now the death penalty is extremely, extremely rare. If you steal someone's book, you're not going to die. So it's actually written in the law how our society has moved away from this obsession and attention towards death.
Yeah.
And in America, there's a big discussion happening about should we even have the death penalty ever? I think in Britain, is it completely illegal, the death penalty?
Completely, yeah, completely
Illegal.
gone for a long time.
It's not illegal.
And I come from a village in East Sussex, Chiddingly, where the last woman who was publicly hanged in England murdered her husband. Yes. Wow. So, and I mean, thank goodness we are having this move away from capital punishment. I think it's abhorrent. But our interest in the value of books, interestingly, in some way hasn't changed. So the idea that you bring up law courts and kind of judicial processes, the idea that you can swear on the Bible or swear on a faith book of your choice or any book of your choice in legal proceedings, because there's this idea that this places an extra moral weight on your shoulders of if you violate your own claim to truth, your faith or your beliefs or something you find important will punish you. And that is done on a material text. I think that's fascinating. We still have that interest.
It's so interesting. It's almost like the materiality kind of crops up in a few different ways, right? So you have a few different kind of things at play here. You have what's written in the text, right? So like if it's a Bible, if it's a book curse, if it's a piece of folklore literature, there can be images of death and dying and physical stuff actually being depicted in the text, in the writing. So it's kind of intellectual, but kind of physical because it's written in ink, but it's also depicting something physical, but it's a fake depiction because it's intellectual. It's like words, so you have that kind of instance. Then you have the physical manifestation of the book itself, and you actually touching the book with your hand and that kind of physical interaction. So you have that second kind of thing there. And then you have a third one of there actually might be physical repercussions. Once you take your hand off the book, something might happen to you, whether it's once you die, maybe you physically go to hell instead of heaven, or maybe something bad will happen to you the next day because of the curse or whatever. So you have three kinds of physical material things at play here, which I think is so interesting.
Yeah, you're completely right. And often those three different planes interact with one another in a really strange way. Often you get this kind of mise en abîme effect of like the mirror that keeps on going. If you put two mirrors in front of one another, it just keeps going back and back and back.
Yes.
And it's sometimes quite difficult to untangle which of those planes something about the perception of the book belongs to. But yeah, I think you're completely right.
Definitely, like where is the physicality coming from and the language coming from, and it's kind of hard to pinpoint sometimes. Definitely. So I would love to hear a little bit about the process of, you kind of already touched on it, but what was it like researching for this book, and how did you kind of carry out those months of research and weaving through all those manuscripts? How was that process for you?
It was at once incredibly fun and incredibly intimidating. I think, we spent however many years kind of honing the specificity of whatever kind of area we're interested in. And then you suddenly have a larger project and you're like, yes, I'm going to have to read things that are outside of my immediate area of comfort. And it was such a good push to do that. So I think one of the most gratifying parts of writing this book was hearing about all of the disparate research that is going on in different periods of literary history across the world, of different scholars doing interesting things, different creative practitioners doing different things. Reading about things like the Ashurbanipal Library project, where they're trying to scan and transliterate and translate all of the texts from all of the tablets, the cuneiform tablets, online and have it so it's like an enormous repository. So they're kind of putting the library back together of collectors who have looked through, and academics who have looked through loads and loads of Edwardian books at secondhand bookshops and found lots of book curses. And I think what was really gratifying was seeing this research and seeing this incredibly hard work going on in lots of different places, often with very different objectives, and kind of pulling those threads together and acknowledging that it was all happening. I think one thing that I wanted to do with this book was really acknowledge some of the kind of hidden secret labour that goes into this kind of project. You know, I wouldn't be able to look at these manuscripts or to find these texts without the librarians and the archivists who catalogue them and look after them and have detailed descriptions. There's no way that I could visit every single book curse that's represented in it. So I had to trust the work of other scholars. I had to trust digitizations or look at copies online. So that was nice, feeling like there's this kind of invisible community, and we're not all working towards the same thing, but we do sometimes have the same interests. That was quite gratifying. And then also, of course, being incredibly anxious of wanting to do all of these different things justice. And, you know, becoming familiar enough with the material to kind of be able to write about it intelligently, and then also know your limits of being like, okay, this is something that I need to hand over to the experts here.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, I mean, it sounds like a very long process that ultimately culminated in this book, which I cannot wait to read. So that's really exciting. Now I would love to speak a little bit about containers. And we kind of touched on this with the Bible and the swearing and things like that. And, you know, textbooks and cookbooks and things like what the text is that you're interacting with and why that's important. But so just to reference your interview again, you spoke about your interest in book materiality and the interesting relationship between literary content and the literary container, I'll call it, as in what the content comes in. Is it a piece of prose? Is it a poem? Is it a cookbook? Is it the Bible? Whatever it may be. Is it written on a bathroom wall? Whatever it may be. So you come to a fascinating conclusion, to quote, that, quote, the richest texts were not those which directly mirrored their containers, but which offered an insight into the perception of different kinds of material texts at once, unquote. So like what that means to me kind of is that the content and the container gesture to a million different other content and containers. And there's infinite significance to the fact that that content is written in that container. And maybe it's incredibly odd that that content is written in that container. For example, a book curse in a cookbook, you know? So why do you think that it's important to take into account materiality and its relationship to literature? And what can we learn from the container that a piece of literature comes in?
I'm really glad. I think you've done a great job of summarizing what I was trying to get at there. So I'm really gratified that it kind of translated. So my doctoral research, when I began it, I was absolutely convinced that what I wanted to look at was texts, literary content, which talked about exactly the kind of books, often was what I was looking at, that they were written in. And that was where the significance was. It was a kind of, as Laura Ash has described it, kind of short circuit of meaning, that it's like, oh, okay, I'm reading a poem about a book that describes a book very much like the one it's written in. And there's a kind of circle of meaning there. It's very self-referential. And that is showing, I wanted to argue, that these authors, that these writers were very aware of the materiality of what they were writing on, and that it was directly informing their creative process in doing so. And I was kind of trying to do this for the first sort of year of my doctoral research. And then it became manifest that wasn't what was happening. That often wasn't what I was finding at all. That exactly as you describe, I was reading texts that were not gesturing towards the kind of material texts they were written on themselves, but imagined texts that didn't exist, different kinds of material texts which were not directly in front of them, texts which were kind of half imagined, half real. So, for example, I'm thinking of things like descriptions of the book of life, where apparently all those who will get into heaven, their names are inscribed in the book of life, which is often described in late medieval texts as looking like an ordinary book. But obviously it has an almost infinite number of, apart from the ones who are going to hell, which are not written in that book, but it has an enormous number of names which cannot possibly be represented in a handheld book. And I just thought, wow, that's so much more imaginative than I was giving these writers credit for, that actually they're not just drawing on the text that's in front of them, although sometimes they do, but they're drawing on the text that they encountered, like you said, graffiti on the walls, embroidered text, inscribed objects like jewelry, texts that they'd seen but hadn't handled. And this came particularly to the fore when looking at a book called The Book of Margery Kempe, which in this it's arguably one of the first examples of an autobiography, but it's described in the text that she's using an amanuensis. So she's dictating the text and someone else is writing it down. And she describes herself as being, to some degree, illiterate. In the late medieval period, that can mean a range of things. That can mean someone fully cannot read or write. It means that someone might have pragmatic literacy, so enough knowledge of reading and writing so that they can do their work, but nothing more. Or it could mean that actually they're very fluent in reading and writing Middle English, but not Latin. So it can mean lots of different things. But she described herself as illiterate, but there were many times in this text when she was encountering books. There's one moment where she's in a church and she has a prayer book, and a portion of the church falls on her, like literally the masonry falls on her head, and she survives, and she credits it to holding this book. And it's just those moments of, okay, so what about these people who couldn't read or write? How are they understanding the material text if they didn't necessarily have that close-up knowledge of working with them directly, if they had more of a kind of cultural knowledge of what they were doing and what they were represented by? So it became something about a broader range of texts than I imagined.
Oh, definitely. It really reminds me of if you a person swearing on a Bible who either cannot read or has never read the Bible, kind of a thing.
Absolutely.
It's about the significance or the imagination of the text and what it actually means to them.
Yeah. And understanding that the book is a material object, that other people perceive that book as having value, and therefore you are interpreting that text as having value, even if you can't read it. They're really tricky kind of amorphous ideas that I think are really worth picking apart. But maybe that's heartening for anyone who's doing their PhD research or master's research or thesis research and thinking, oh my gosh, this is going off in a completely different direction than I thought it was going to. I think that happens with everyone. It means you're doing new research. That is the work, as they say.
Yeah, definitely. I actually remember the Book of Margery Kempe. We had to read it when I was in first year. And I remember thinking, what is this book? This is so wild. I had never read anything like it before. And it was a big point of conversation that she was dictating the book. Because, does that classify her as having written it? Does it not? That kind of, that whole kind of,
exactly,
kind of mentality. And I think it brings up a lot of questions about materiality for sure. So I was just also wondering so you speak about how, quote, your general interest has therefore always revolved around what books as material objects mean to people and how they impact people's behavior, right? And I think that's something that we literally just touched on, about the significance of the book itself, not necessarily what is written in it, which is a crazy thing to say, because what is a book if you're not going to read it, right? But on the contrary, it actually is very significant sometimes.
And it happens all the time. So I can think of examples that you quite commonly see on social media are outcries whenever a library does a deaccessioning process, which means they're going through their collections. And if maybe certain books haven't been checked out a certain number of times, or not at all in some cases, they might actually be thrown away. They might go to the tip or be burnt or whatever to remove them from the library. And there will be, you know, every, I think, 6 to 12 months, someone will take a photo of a load of books in a dumpster and say, this is disgusting. It is outrageous. I can't believe we're throwing away books. And then in the comments are all these librarians saying, like, you know, no one was reading them. Like, that's what we do. There's no, you know, and they argue that everything has to be kind of prioritized. A library is a set space. There is not infinite space. And some form of prioritization has to happen to make sure that people are accessing the resources they need. But people have that sense of books being objects which they cannot possibly throw away, that to throw away a book is a metaphor for throwing away human experience and knowledge, and that throwing away any book is a problem. And it's often reflected in readers as well. And I make no judgment of this, but I am a real, I dog ear the pages of my books. I often don't use a bookmark, not library books, I should add, but I will often fold the corner of a book down. I will also break the spine. I like having a spine broken. I don't like having it stiff. Yeah, I also read in the bath. These are all things which some readers are like, you disgusting, how could you? How could you do that to us?
Too. I have a friend who is he keeps his books like pristine, and he's always like, oh my God, your books are your poor books, they're crying out for help. I'm like, this is actually how I show my love to my books. It shows I've read them so much.
Yeah. So that in itself is really interesting, right? So we're perceiving how we show our commitment to reading or our love of books in different ways. So for me, it's having read it and revisited it, and that for me looks like messing up the structure of a book. And if it completely, you know, falls apart, I'll buy another one. But for some people, that is the complete opposite. You show respect for the text, and that shows the value of the book. And that people often become, as in the case of book curses, very attached to particular material copies of a text. Maybe it reminds them of it being read to them as a child, or maybe it was gifted to them by someone significant. So it's still really present. It's not necessarily a sign of ignorance or superstition to have these kind of value systems around the material text. We do it all the time.
Exactly. And it literally depicts how the physical book itself has different significance to different people. Like this book should be pristine to show I love it, or this book should be worn and well loved to show I love it. So, which is crazy. It's literally opposite, as you say. And I'm also wondering, do you think that our modern relationship to our literary forms or our containers, our material containers, I think is the best way to put it. Do you think our modern relationship to these forms has changed? Like, do you think that we conceive of these books and these forms and these containers differently to those living in the medieval age? Like, for example, the curses, like they're going to curse their books. Like, I personally don't. I don't know if you do, but like,
yeah, you know? I might start. And in fact, one of the things that I did for this book curses book is I composed my own book curse, which sits at the start of the book. So that is officially the first book I've ever cursed in. It's my own. Love it. Yeah, I mean, obvious things that would mean that our perception of change has been the advent of the digital age. And I don't know if you remember, but there was a huge kind of furore about when ebooks kind of came onto the scene for the public as to what this was going to do to the publishing industry, who were selling hard copy texts. Yes. And that they actually found that the answer was not much at all. People still gravitated towards hard copy books, and even if they had the ebook, if they liked it, they'll often go and buy the hard copy. And you see this a lot on places like Book Talk, or they'll buy, you know, bespoke copies that have beautifully decorated covers. And that brings out really interesting ideas about how we value texts. And then I've also seen kind of the other more problematic side of teachers of early years pupils saying that kids are coming to school not understanding how to use the materiality of a text because they're so used to screens. So they will swipe at the cover of a book because they're used to a screen that moves that way rather than turning the pages of a book. Yeah.
That is so sad. I'm sorry. That is crazy.
But even that statement, right? That's sad. So we're allotting value to a text that's material, but they might have some reading comprehension digitally. It's just not with the hard copy book. So we do these interesting things. So I think
have all
that's
these
one
value
kind
systems. Value systems.
Yeah. I think that's one kind of conception. I mean, for me also, I think there are certain things that you never lose the kind of the tactile value of. So for example, I will always handwrite notes to something, despite it being very inconvenient to return to them. I might type them up later. It depends what setting I'm in, but I will often still handwrite something if it's something I want to remember, because I don't remember words that I type in the same way as words that I handwrite. So there are all these difficult things. I think also attitudes towards book destruction have changed with monumental events like the Holocaust and mass book burnings. This idea of in that very specific case, faith books or books that were perceived as representative of the political arguments that they contained being destroyed, much like the bodies who owned them or wrote them were being destroyed. I think that's maybe why we have more of a kind of, we afford more of a collective significance to the idea of destroying books, because we have had these monumental political events where that kind of iconoclasm of the book, of book destruction, has been, one of the key kind of touchstone images of that era. So
definitely.
I think there are some things that we have retained, and some things that have necessarily been different throughout time.
Very true. It's making me think a lot about banned books, like in the States right now, in the South, especially in like Kentucky, Indiana. There's this movement of the senators are trying to ban a lot of books in high schools. And it reminds me of what you were saying about how a book has meaning when even if you haven't read it. Like I think a lot of these senators haven't even read any of these books. But they still want to ban them and from the school curriculum, from the school libraries, publish books, on all sorts of topics, witches, different things. I don't know. And also I think with what's happening in America right now with abortion and abortion law, there are a lot of, texts and, manuals and insightful, informative, books and things like that. They're being banned. So it's about kind of what the book represents almost more than what is actually physically written. It's like about the relationship to the fact that the book should contain something, we don't know what it is, but it contains something.
This very kind of moralizing attitude that it's kind of apportioning a certain value to the written word and to literature as well, that the only books that should exist in a school offer this very white, Western, Christian, often conservative, small c conservative perspective on the world, and if they're not offering that, then they are not a good book. And these conceptions of what makes a good book as well kind of crop up. But I think you're completely right that these questions of book destruction and preservation are still super prevalent. They're still active issues that have far-reaching consequences, like how do we educate our children? What do we prioritize? What does it mean that a child doesn't know how to navigate a book? What does it mean that a woman can't access information about her own body? All of those different things they're really current issues. So as much as I maybe, I enjoy finding the humor, I enjoy finding the moments of lightness, a bit like returning to our discussion of death, it's really a two-handed thing.
Definitely. No, I think that literally hits the nail on the head. And I want to turn just quickly, because, I don't want to keep all of your time today. But, I want to turn quickly to the idea of containers and materiality when it comes to book curses. Because I think we kind of touched on this already, but this kind of relationship between what's written, the container, and then the real world. What happens in relation to the container and also what's written. So this physical kind of in citation, written down, the fact that it's physically written down, and the potential that it will happen in the real world. So 3 kind of things interacting with each other here. And so you've spoken about how these curses come in such a variety of places, in a variety of containers. To use your words, you say, in a variety of settings, from 12th century wills to 17th century recipe books and late medieval commonplace books to 19th century school textbooks. So that is about as diverse as it gets, I think. That is so interesting, the fact that the same curses were seen over and over and over and over again in so many years span. And so I'm just wondering what you think about the material relationship between book curses and their containers. How do they interact? Like when looking where a book curse is written, does our relationship to the curse change? What can we learn from where a curse is written, why it's written there? Is the container at all significant, do you think? Or it's just, it could be anything. Or maybe it means something very, very specific, actually, and it maybe changes the entire meaning of the book curse. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, so one point that I think is really interesting is all bar one of the examples included in the book curses book are still extant. They're still in the world. So it could be argued that the book curses have, to a certain degree, done their job in that these books still exist. They have not been lost to time. The exception to this rule is one manuscript that we know had a book curse, but only because this was detailed in the auction catalogue at which it was sold. And there's no information about where that manuscript was then sold to. So that is the only manuscript which doesn't have a direct shelf reference to where somebody could feasibly go and find it. So that's the exception to the rule. I think your question about where the book curse is placed impacting the perception of the curse and also the perception of the material text is a really interesting one. I think, for example, when a curse is placed at the beginning of a book, it really frames your reading experience. If the curse is the first writing that you encounter, I think that really does frame how you perceive the text. And as we were just talking about, the value that we afford it as well. And maybe you're perceiving that, this was a really valuable text to someone else. Now, how do I understand it because of that? I think one of the interesting things about written curses is curses, I was going to say tend to be verbal, but curses can be verbal, which means that they're perhaps only existing as long as that person is speaking them, or for the duration of that person's life while they carry the memory of that being spoken. Whereas a written text, a written book curse, has a far longer longevity, that can outlast the life cycle of the human who wrote it, way, way, way into the future. It's interesting. I think one of the first things that you noted about book curses is that I think all of the examples that I included are conditional. So you will not enact these punishments unless you do this certain thing. So it takes the misdeed happening for the impact of the curse to be triggered. So we can't comment on the efficacy of the curses until it happens. So I think there are loads and loads of different threads of the degree to the material text being important, where it's placed. One thing that I really wanted to do and kind of argued the case for was that alongside each curse, I've included a kind of paragraph of description of what we know about that material text and that curse itself. So do we know who wrote it? Do we know where they wrote it? Do we know anything else about the history of that particular material text that makes this really interesting? And my process of prioritization was choosing the texts that have those really interesting narratives. So the interesting texts in and of themselves, are they really vicious, ferocious, or do they appear in a book that is itself interesting for how it changed hands and who it belonged to and where it is now?
That is really fascinating. That I can't really imagine the breadth of curses you must have found, because I feel like they're all so different, but they all have links to each other, and I find the whole ultimatum, the unless, That is so interesting, because the unless is not intellectual, it's not language, it's physical. So it's almost like language is directly relating to the physical realm, which I just find so interesting. I don't know why I find that so odd. I think I really tend to intellectualize words and language. It feels very airy to me and intellectual, you know.
One thing that really helped me understand that connection between, you know, just how close materiality and sort of ephemerality or imaginativeness are connected is a book called Metaphors We Live By. And I was directed towards it by my PhD supervisor, Professor Daniel Wakelin. And it's a whole book that is about how metaphors don't just help us understand the world around us, they inform how we think about it. So, for example, if I was to say to you, I'm feeling really low today, how would you understand that?
You're feeling sad today.
I'm feeling sad. Right. That has nothing to do with spatially where I am. I'm not crouched on the floor doing anything, but because of the way our language works and the way that metaphors are so embedded in the way that we speak, you understand that when I'm referring to a spatial metaphor of being low, I mean I'm feeling sad, and there is no relationship between those two things.
That is so interesting. I've literally never thought of that in my life. Like that
was so mind-blowing to me. I was like, pooh, the lights came on moment.
Like,
and just once you see it, you can't let go. You see all of these other examples.
I literally just thought of two, right? Like we have like stand up for yourself. Stand up where? Why are we standing up? We have like, I don't know, like stand back from the spotlight, literally standing back. We have calm down, why down.
Daphne is very bright.
Yeah.
I mean, you may be physically glowing, but that's not what someone is talking about when they apply that to you. It's really, the way that words work is fascinating. And I feel like that's, you know, behavioral psychologists and linguists, I'm sure would provide you fascinating answers on that question.
It's very cool. Okay, so this is our kind of closing segment, our closing section, which is very sad. Thank you so much for sticking here so long with us. This has been absolutely fascinating so far. So I am really interested in the relationship between language and a notion of cursing. So we're using language to inflict a curse. We're using language to inflict a punishment, kind of like how we're talking about. And would you say that language has more power in this physical realm in the medieval age? Do you think that they saw language as this weapon, this physical weapon, more than we see and view and understand language to be in this age? Like, do you think that this cultural and socio-political conception of language in the medieval age was very different than today's? And why? Is kind of my curious thought.
I'm gonna give the kind of coward's ambiguous answer in being like it is significant in both for different reasons. I think in the later medieval period, I think you have to acknowledge the impact of pragmatic literacy and literacy rates, this idea that there were great swathes of the population who did not understand the written word, but understood its significance and understood its power. And that connect between not being able to decode letter forms yourself, but understanding that they have power, leaves a kind of gap of understanding that can be filled with lots of different things. It's like a lacuna, which people then reflect their preconceptions about. So the ability for words to then enact things could be related to the esoteric. It could be related to the religious. And then ideas like, oh, particular classes are powerful because they are better than other people. The sense of the reason in that becomes really evident because, oh, these people can read and they have the power of words, and that's making people do things, but I don't have the ability to do that. So they must have some greater power than I do. And therefore their wealth and social status is well bestowed. So there's lots of kind of conceptions like that, and then you can see the importance of greater literacy rates among kind of the merchant classes or even the lower classes, or vernacular literacy, why it becomes so important, because that lacuna starts to disappear. More and more people have an understanding. But then I think, you know, in asking me that question about modern audiences, I then think about social media, and I think about the enormous ability that the digital world has to impact real life circumstances, in terms of, you know, if you're the recipient of cyberbullying,
That is so true.
Your business, it harms your mental health. That's no less, you know, sometimes it can be unhelpful to have this distinction of real and unreal, or even material and immaterial, if the same sense is being conveyed. So yeah, I think it's a really fascinating question that I think is difficult to look at head on.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was just thinking of our book curses, the medieval cyberbullying.
Yeah, exactly. That's such an interesting one. Yeah, or you know, maybe when we were younger, those weird, I think they're now called copy pasta. You know, when it would be like, you get those chain emails where it was like, if you don't send this email to 12 people, you know.
I used to get those.
Yeah, exactly. This child will appear in your mirror, and this is the story of what happened to that would like barely make sense. You know, is this the older version of the copy pasta email?
This is so funny, because in asking that question, I kind of had my own, as we always do, like our own preconceived guesses of what an answer could be, kind of thing. Yeah. And I was just assuming that, like, you might say, oh, definitely in the medieval ages, they were into rituals, they were into religion, they were living in the middle of nowhere, language carried power, language could enact death, a curse was physical, language was more physical than it is today. But you're really drawing out these really big nuances and complications that it's actually not true at all. Like, if you're so right about social media, if you see sometimes people get tons of comments, go kill yourself, go die, you know, never post again, all this stuff. And then they actually end up killing themselves. So that's a literal interpretation of how language is becoming physical, you know?
Yeah, and I think it's always tempting when we look at historical literature, and it's a very human reaction to look at people in the past and assume ignorance or assume a lack of understanding that doesn't map on well to our own. Whereas actually there are so many more points of similarity, that these are kind of very human traits that are picked up across time.
Definitely. It really makes me think about humans and their use of language as a weapon to like cause destruction and like death and punishment. And, you know, people are punishing with their words. People are punishing on social media. People are punishing in book curses. And it really shows this very horrific, folk horrific side of human nature and language.
Yeah, that was beautifully tied together.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I want to say thank you so much for joining us today. I learned a lot. I had a great conversation, I think, about like all of these threads kind of being tied together, as you were saying, and kind of depicting a world in which the medieval world and the modern world exist on the same plane. You know, and I think that is fascinating.
Much for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure, and thank you for articulating so clearly some things that are kind of held amorphously in my head. It's wonderful to hear something
so much.
respond to it. So thank you so much for having me, Daphne.